What is good, my ex-homies? It's your boy Jacob Gooden, and we're back for another week in the Ex-Homeschoolers Club house. Oh my gosh, that is a tongue twister today for some reason, but it is a-okay. Today, I've got my new friend Mindy in here, and we're going to talk a little bit, not so much about homeschool. We are going to talk about homeschooling, but her education background is a little bit different. She was not a homeschool kid in the traditional sense, but she did do some online schooling. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. And then we're going to get into homeschooling as it sits today, and kind of the influence that it's having over culture and our politics in the US and things like that. So, without further ado, and without me boring too much, let me bring Mindy in here. Mindy, welcome to the Ex-Homeschoolers Club.
Hello. Hi there,
I'm
Jacob.
I'm giving you your honorary homeschool badge for the day because as you and I chatted before, like you're not a homeschooler in like the traditional sense. I know you had an
hmm
untraditional education background, but walk us through a little bit of your educational background and what part of it was traditional, what part of it was untraditional, and let's start there.
So for elementary school, I went to what was called a year-round school. So instead of having 3 months off for the summer, we would have our breaks in the middle of the year. So like I remember one time we would have a break in November, and then maybe we would have had a break in February, but then I remember we always had July off. So it was still public school, but we just had a bit of a different schedule. We did not have quarters. We did not get like a report card every quarter. We instead had trimesters. So we got a
Okay.
report card every trimester. So that was interesting. And then middle school, I actually went to two different middle schools. The first middle school I went to, that one was pretty interesting because it was a middle school that was known for having low standardized test scores. And I remember the first year for sixth grade, as the year I was coming in, they were thinking about possibly adopting uniforms. And side note, all the research on uniforms shows that it doesn't work. So it just doesn't work. I remember my parents really did not like the idea of uniforms and I didn't like it. I remember we even had like a meeting before the school year started where like I guess the principal thought we were all gonna love it because she was talking about how uniforms are so great. And literally all the parents who talked to her, they all were like, "This is awful. What are you talking about? Here's this article from the New York Times that says uniforms don't work." So that was a doozy. But then again, in seventh grade, at the same school, I remember for our standardized testing, we actually had an assembly where they like showed us a slideshow of J.K. Rowling and John Lennon and Bill Gates, and this was supposed to motivate us to do well on the standardized testing. And what I later found out is that they were trying to fire all the teachers and hire new teachers. Keep in mind, this was during No Child Left Behind, so they were trying to, really see things through the lens of standardized testing. And ultimately, the school did not do very good on the standardized testing, but I had really good test scores. And the what would have been eighth grade, they were going to implement not uniforms, but a stricter dress code. And I didn't like the idea that I was going to be punished for something I didn't do. So ultimately, I ended up going to a different middle school for eighth grade. And interesting thing about eighth grade, one of my friends that I made, it was her first year there too, and she was a homeschooler. This is her first year in public school, but she was a pagan homeschooler. And I found out
Interesting.
about her. She would have gone into high school that year, but she tested into eighth grade. Apparently, this is very common amongst public schools when homeschoolers are coming back. Usually, they'll put you in with the grade that responds to your age group, but with high school, they'll test you to see where you're at, and then you'll get placed in whatever grade you're in. And she got placed into eighth grade when she should have been a freshman. So that was interesting. And she claims that she had all A's in her homeschooling, but it's interesting that, she got placed. But apparently, that's another common experience with homeschoolers going back to public school is being placed a grade lower than they should.
Yeah, I had a guest on not terribly long ago at this point, and she talked about her mom kind of got a little fed up when she was in high school and was going to send her back to traditional public school, and she had to she did the testing, and I think she was supposed to be a junior, and they were going to place her in freshman year, and she was just like, "Screw this! I'm not going down that route." So
Yeah, I keep hearing this coming up, especially with because a lot of homeschoolers, it looks like, do not take the typical state standardized testing. They do their own testing. And I guess sometimes there's a misalignment with the testing homeschoolers take versus the state standardized tests.
yeah, I'm not 100% sure on that, but I wouldn't be. I wouldn't be that shocked by it, to be quite honest. So let's talk after 8th grade. Now you're going into high school and online school is now an option for you. What led you to decide that, or led your parents to decide that that was what you guys wanted to do?
I should probably piggyback to elementary school. In elementary school, I was the kid who got bullied. There was one time where I actually stepped out of class and the school counselor came into my class and she gave her own speech about how, hey, you should not be bullying her. Like that's how bad it was. And whenever I do tell people like the full extent of like what happened and why I was bullied, everyone always asks me, "Hey, how come you weren't homeschooled? Or how come your parents didn't just switch schools?" For elementary school, for me, that just wasn't an option. We couldn't really drive to another elementary school, and my parents, um, they really are not the kind of parents who are able to homeschool, and certainly not homeschool well. So it just really wasn't an option. So unfortunately, I just kind of had to deal with it. And I'll tell you right now, it did not make me stronger. It didn't make my personality better or any of the other things you hear that make, that says that bullying is a good thing. It was just awful. And it still affects me to this day, unfortunately. But yeah, I was that kid. And I don't think it was that bad in middle school. It's weird because once you get to like teenage years, bullying becomes a lot more subtle. And especially if you're like me, I'm ADHD, so combination autistic ADHD. It's a little bit harder to pick up on. But now looking back, I'm like, oh yeah, it was happening in a way that I didn't realize. And I think it was part of me was scared to go to high school. And also because the feeder middle school that was my first middle school was to a different high school than the high school I was with in 8th grade. So I kind of feel like I was having to choose which high school to go to. And also, I kept hearing about homeschooling, and I'm only now finding out that online school and homeschooling are kind of different, and a lot of people don't think that they're a part of the same category. But I remember thinking, like, maybe that's a good idea because I kept hearing you could skip grades or graduate early or do things at your own pace, and you wouldn't have to get up early or follow a set schedule. So I'm like, that sounds really cool. I think I'd like to give that a go. And that's what I said to my 8th grade guidance counselor. I was like, hey, I'd like to give this homeschooling thing a go. And she did give me a packet about homeschooling laws and regulations for my state. So that's what makes it seem to me like they're kind of the same, but finding out they actually are different. But yeah, that's what prompted me to go. I wanted to be able to do things at my own pace and not face my fear of high school, really.
What's so interesting about that is like, well, one, I think defining online school as a part of homeschool, like I view it as a umbrella. Homeschool is a gigantic
Mhm.
umbrella, and then inside of it, there are obviously all the different types of home education. And so I grew up in very much um, what would be privatized home education, which is my parents decided every piece of curriculum that I was going to learn. They built all of not necessarily built the curriculums, but they would purchase curriculums, but they got to customize every piece of it. So maybe math was one was we did Math UC, and then maybe history was a Becca or something like that, right? So there was all these different things funneling into our home education. That also meant that my parents got to decide what we were focusing on history wise. So, I mean, there was a whole year in high school I wanted to just study war and understand the American history of war. And so we started the Revolutionary War. We ended, I want to say Vietnam was kind of when we ended that section, but things like that. So there was a lot of customization as far as what was being studied. And then on top of it, the flexibility within our homeschool. Now, that being said, there's also things like charter schools, or in your case, online schools that give kind of a homeschool esque approach in that you get to be at home, maybe you set your pace, those types of things. But your parent is not the one who is deciding this is the curriculum you're going to be learning, this is the history you're going to be taking, or whatever. And so again, it's this weird kind of umbrella thing because as a kid, I would have said, no, you were not homeschooled. And even today, like
Right, right.
there's a part of me that's like Mindy was not homeschooled. However, that's not totally true because I do believe it falls under the umbrella of home education.
Right.
Well, like I said, it's this gigantic umbrella. And so,
Mhm.
um, so tell me a little bit about the online schooling like system and how it worked for you, and maybe give us like a little bit of like a day in the life of it, just for those of us who are unfamiliar. Because I mean, I barely did any school on the computer. I had a few classes that I took
Mm,
on the computer, but for the most part, it was not the case. And also, I mean, I think online education is probably even more different today than it was
hmm
for us when we were kids. But because now we have things like Zoom and video conferencing is way easier than it used to be and things like that. So, but give me a little bit of a snapshot of what it looked like.
So I actually got sent a laptop from the school itself. So that's how we did it, was through our laptop. And we also got sent a microphone. Pretty much what you would do is you would log on and do your classes. You'd have the classes you were enrolled in, and it kind of followed a similar public school situation, but it was through the computer and through the login. And once a week, we would have what was called Class Connect, where you would be like what we're doing right now through Zoom or through any other sort of online video conferencing, where we would all get together and meet with our teacher that once a week. And we also had the option to go to a tutoring center, a which was in person, and that I really liked because I got to connect with people in person. And I remember part of me thought maybe I should just go every day. And then it's like, well, if I'm gonna go every day, shouldn't I go back to like public school? But I love the tutoring
Right.
center.
Right.
And here's another interesting thing at the tutoring center. That was the first time anyone as a kid offered me cigarettes. One of the kids at the tutoring center one time offered me a cigarette.
Interesting.
So to me, that's like, if you're going to be in the homeschool world or homeschool adjacent, you could say in my case, like, don't think it's, kids are going to not experience those kind of things, because it very much is.
Yeah.
And it's interesting I bring that up, the whole homeschool experience, because I remember one girl in the tutoring center who, like, she very much looked homeschooled. Like, she wore long denim skirts and had uncut hair. Like, you could tell that she was here to get her high school diploma through, like, the public school system. I guess her parents, thought it was okay. And I remember one time in one of those Class Connect sections, a teacher mentioned that the two main kids who went through the online high school were either kids who were homeschooled their whole lives and this was how they were going to get their high school diploma, or kids who were teen parents. And that apparently those two groups of kids did not get along. And she was just trying to tell us, hey, get along. We're all here to, do our work and do what we're supposed to do. So get along. So that was interesting. I'm definitely, I guess, not even a traditional online school student in that sense. So that's interesting to think about.
Yeah, you're talking about it. I'm thinking, I'm like, oh my gosh, it's like the Sharks and the Jets, right? You've got,
Yeah.
like you said, you have like more of a traditional homeschool that probably is coming from a very conservative religious
Mhm.
background with the very much like heavy purity culture influence. And then, yeah, if you have teen
Mhm.
parents,
Oh
teen
yeah.
moms specifically in there, I mean, that goes against pretty much everything that is
Yeah.
being taught in that kind of religious environment. So I could definitely understand there being some kind of conflict. So do you feel like the online school system worked for you or not? Like because I mean you were saying you really enjoyed going to the tutoring and the one-on-one sessions, which again is like you were saying, it's almost like should I go every day? Well, then I'm basically just back in public school.
Right.
So were you finding that online was working for you where you did have to hold yourself accountable or was it really not the path for you?
There were some classes that I could do pretty easily. Like, I sped through them within a week, so it didn't take that long. But I think the biggest thing for me was doing math. Math has never been my strong subject. And it's interesting with going down the rabbit hole of homeschooling in general. There's this thing called the homeschool math gap, where homeschoolers and this is the same true for online schoolers, do worse in math. We have data going back to 2015 that online schoolers are about a year behind in math. And it's crazy to think that that was exactly how it was for me. I did lose a year in math because I just could not figure out how to do it on my own, even with curriculum, even through the Class Connect sessions, even through going to the tutoring center. Because again, it's like the tutors, I feel like, well, they are teachers, but they're not necessarily specializing in all the different subjects. So it's not like I can go there and be like, here's the math teacher, here's the history teacher, or like it's whoever's available that day. So in that sense, I just couldn't do that.
Which makes sense. And I agree with you. I think in the homeschool world, a lot of something that gets talked a lot about in the homeschool arena is the fact of like the independence, right? Especially for kids,
Mhm.
the independence of like they start to be able to teach themselves things. Well, okay, maybe that's true for some students. Some students have the capability of doing that, but not every subject. I mean, I'm like I struggled in math too. I'm thankful I had a dad who he's a math whiz. So
Good.
and he had the time to sit down with me and say, okay, hey, you're struggling in division or whatever. Let's talk
Hmm.
about it, kind of a thing. But there are definitely other areas where it was not my strong suit. It was not my parents' strong suit. And so those areas of my life are just weaker. Science is a big one for
Right.
me that I'm still piecing together. Like,
Hmm.
what did I miss here? And it's hard because since science is not my thing and I've never enjoyed it all that much, it's hard even as an adult, even as almost a 30-year-old man, to go,
Hmm.
okay, I want to learn this. I want to learn this basic
Hmm.
scientific principle. Um, so there's that. I think I'd be interested to know from your perspective. I kind of am interested in why you've become so interested in the homeschool world because I like I get it from a homeschooler like me's perspective who had 10 years in it where I definitely was like, you know, now over a decade out of it and so I think there's just been a lot of learning of myself and my childhood where I'm like, okay, I'm interested to know, did this hurt me? Did this harm me? Those types of things. But I'm interested for you as someone who primarily went through public school and then had this year of online education that we're going to put it in the homeschooling umbrella, under the homeschooling umbrella. This year of homeschool for you. Why is that such an interest to you now of understanding the homeschool world?
I think when you're 10 years or so out of being in high school or college or whatever your education was, that's when you really see the results of how it went. And after my year of online school, I ended up going back to public high school, but after 2 years there, I ended up dropping out and getting my GED. And there's a part of me that thinks, had I just gone straight to a public high school, I could have gone the whole 4 years, graduate, and perhaps the whole trajectory of my life would be completely different. Um, and looking back at the whole thing, I'm just like, this really shouldn't have happened. And that definitely prompted me to look more into this. And then it's like there's this whole world. But also, we are now at a point where 6% of kids in the United States are being homeschooled. And that's way more than it was when we were kids. I think it was only about 1%, but now it's shot up to 6%, especially post COVID.
Yeah.
And but also, we have at least 3 generations of adults, almost 4. We've got, Gen X, who was really the pioneer generation, and then millennials who kind of perfected it, if you will, and now you've got Gen Z, and in just a couple of years, Gen Alpha is gonna be adults, which means you're gonna be talking to some former Gen Alpha homeschoolers, which that's gonna be interesting to see.
Yes.
And I'm just looking at this thinking, like, if I'm having these issues as someone who went through a very structured form of homeschool adjacent education, and I'm struggling, what is it like for everyone else who went through something different, where it's like your mom taught you algebra at the kitchen table sort of situation? And it's hard to tell because it feels like there's 2 different camps. There's either the camp of people who are like, homeschooling was amazing. It's the reason I am who I am today. These are the kind of people that are promoted by homeschooling organizations. That's, evidence that homeschooling works. And then you've got the other people on the other end of the spectrum who are like, homeschooling is the worst thing ever. No one should be homeschooled. We should make homeschooling illegal. And you don't often get the middle ground, which, by the way, I think you're doing a wonderful job at bringing in people with that middle ground perspective because,
Thank you.
every we don't get that middle ground perspective. But it's just now because there's so many adults who were homeschooled, we're seeing the result of that. And we need to talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly of it all.
Let me tap into that just a little bit because I think it's really interesting because at the time of recording this, one of the things I've been, I think, wrestling a little bit with of this show is I get both sides of the coin. I try to be in the middle, like you were saying. I think there's some good, I think there's some bad, and I think there's some ugly. It's really interesting because I get hit from both sides. I have the people who tell me, "Well, you only talk about the negative." Okay, that can be valid. We provide criticism on almost every episode
Mhm.
of the homeschool world. But we also talk about sometimes the fun stuff, right? There was school dances for me. There's a lot of fun moments. I was part of a mime team. I played paintball and airsoft with my buddies, like in the middle of the week, and stuff that I've been to Disneyland on a school day and done school
Mhm.
at Disneyland, like stuff like that that is really fun and was a positive, I think, experience in my homeschool world. But then there's also the negative, like I was saying with science.
Right.
Science not a strong suit for me.
Mhm.
Well, there's a criticism there. We can provide better
Right.
education. I also get hit from the other side of people who are like, "You're not
I'm gonna interject for
anti-homeschool
a
enough."
little
Yeah,
bit, if you don't mind.
yeah,
I think I'm not saying that your situation was abusive or that homeschooling in general is abusive, but one of the things you hear from people who were in abusive situations is that it's not always you're being like locked up in the basement, chained, and it's awful 1,000% of the time. You'll have the experiences where you have people who, went to Disneyland one time or even every year, but they were still in an awful situation. So, you know, there are those weird things, and that also kind of clouds your memory because you're like, yeah, but I did this, and because not everyone gets to go to Disneyland, so you may be
right,
thinking, was I really in a bad situation if I went to Disneyland? Because, you know, and
yeah,
it's also interesting to bring that up too, because we can maybe talk about this more a little bit later, but one of the stories that sticks out to me, because I one time was in a Facebook group of former evangelical Christians, and I asked them, hey, I am someone who is curious about the homeschooling movement becoming more common, and I know this is a former evangelical group, so there's a lot of us here who are probably homeschooled. What's everyone's experience? And one of the stories that really stands out to me is this girl who was a former, what we would today call a van lifer, a van life kid, the kids who like travel in vans or in their cars all over the country. And she talked about how she had all these amazing experiences that nobody gets to have, but that she feels like her education was neglected to the point that when she speaks to people in person, they assume that English is not her first language. So that's got to be tough because it
yeah.
wasn't bad 100% of the time, but on the other hand, your education was severely neglected.
Right. Well, and the emphasis that was put on what she was learning is maybe
Right,
not
right.
the proper things, right?
Mhm.
And I think that's where I sit with a lot of things currently is like I believe that homeschool can be a good solution for kids. I think that public school can be a good solution for kids. Private school can be a good solution and charter school and all these different things. There are many different types of education. I think all of them can be good. And I think it's our job, like you were saying, with all the generations that have come through these things at this point, it's our job to help shape the laws and the structure of how that's going to look. And
Right.
so I'm a huge advocate for a little bit more guardrails in the homeschool world so that girls like that who do have the van life experience, which can be very fun, but
And I think
also
you've interviewed a couple van life moms too.
yes, I have. And so, but they also can have the guardrails of saying, but also it's important as a society, we've decided math, science, English are important things,
Mhm.
and that child development, you know, gets us to these certain points by these certain times. And so I think
Mhm.
that it's a hard thing to regulate because, every kid is different. But I do think that
Right,
there
right.
are some guardrails and things that we can put in place. And I think universally, I think most people can agree there are just certain things in life that are important to know. And
Mhm.
I maybe call me an optimist, maybe, because I'm sure there are people out there that are like the unschooling folks I know definitely are like, no, my kid is going to learn what they want to learn, when they want to learn it, how they want to
Mhm.
learn it. It's like, well, I think, need some structure in there. That's my opinion,
Noticed a
and
lot
that's
of unschooling families will do formal math. I've noticed again, it seems like they've also picked up on the math thing where they're like, we do need to focus on math.
yeah. Well, it's really interesting. So I'm currently reading a book called Homeschooled. It came out
Mm.
the end of last year by Stephen Merrill Block, and it's really interesting because his story is one of getting pulled out of school. I'm trying to
Mhm.
remember exactly what the reasons why, but part of it is like it seems like his mom has a little bit of depression. She's
Mhm.
struggling with some things, and so he's around. What's really interesting is the emphasis that she puts on math, and she's really good at math
Mm.
to the point where,
Okay.
as time progresses, she is a math tutor to all these other kids, and they come over to the
Mm.
house, and so he has no problems with math, or so it seems, because his mom is really good at math, and she really puts a huge emphasis on math being important for him. But when it comes to
Mm.
everything else, it's really about just reading books or doing these
Mhm.
flashcards and kind of he has some understanding of things. And I'm currently at the point in the book where he has now gone back into the public school system and he's starting to
Mm.
realize the holes that exist in his education, and he's
Mhm.
trying to play a little bit of catch up there. And so, but when it comes to math, he's all good, you know. And so I do think that
Mhm.
that's an interesting thing. And so I would be
Homeschool
fascinated to
math is its
know.
own subject, apparently.
Yeah, like
You could do a whole
I
roundtable just about homeschool math.
why is math the thing that everybody's
Yeah,
like,
what
we
is
have to do math, we have to nail that?
math is so structured and it's not something that you can really learn on your own. Because I feel like with reading or history or science, as long as you can read at least, let's say, a third or fourth grade level, and you know how to use a dictionary and you know how to look up stuff, you could probably be let loose in a library somewhere. Although, with the current state of homeschooling, a lot of people are very anti-library, as I have found out. But other than that, you could maybe teach yourself some things in that regard. But when it comes to math, I feel like that's just something that you can't just let a kid learn by themselves.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Is it does feel like it's the one subject that is, it just requires the most of like that passing down of information in a more traditional teaching setting where, yeah,
Hmm.
to your point of like, if you know how to read, you can kind of learn anything.
Right.
You can learn anything else pretty easily if you try.
Hmm.
I think it would be, I'd be interested to know your take on like, because I feel like you said, 6% of kids are now homeschooled.
Hmm.
2020, I think, is a big result of kind of the spike in interest
Yeah.
in homeschooling. Um, but I think even more than that, it's been interesting to start to learn and look through some documentaries on how it's been a long time in the making that I feel like the seed was planted of like homeschooling being this kind of solution, um and maybe an indoctrination of getting kids to a point where then they start to take political office, they start to have positions of
Hmm.
power in our culture and in our even just our micro societies, right, of our towns
Hmm.
and things like that. And so I'm interested to know if you've got any thoughts on that, because, like you were saying, we're 4 generations in now. The millennials, or the Gen Xers, the millennials, and Gen
Hmm.
Z. I'm a cusper, so I'm right in that like millennial
Same,
Gen
same. Yep.
Z space where, but it definitely is very interesting because, yeah, I'm seeing more and more people kind of, yeah, come to power. And even as a kid, I remember being kind of told like, you guys are the generation that's going to shape the
Hmm.
world,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah.
So I'm interested if you got any thoughts on that.
Yeah, absolutely. Like one of the things I noticed going down this rabbit hole is it almost feels like homeschooling is a pipeline for organizations like ALEC, the Heritage Foundation, HSLDA, Alliance Defending Freedom, because you go through homeschool with their homeschool curriculum. You then go to like Patrick Henry College, which was founded by Michael Ferris, or Harding, or Hillsdale, or any of these other big conservative universities, and then you get picked up there, either going to conservative law schools. And interesting about that, I had someone say that getting a law degree is actually pretty easy for homeschoolers because of homeschool debate, or being made to defend your stance. So I thought that was easy. So when you hear about homeschool lawyers, um, you could maybe argue that homeschooling is a training ground for conservative lawyers. And then through there, they go on to work for these big uh, conservative organizations that are now shaping policy.
You might be onto something because I did take speech and debate when I was a kid,
Mm,
and I think there is kind of, it doesn't. What's interesting about some of the conversation inside the homeschooling world of I think there are a lot of stereotypes that get put on homeschoolers of like, they're kind of the weird antisocial kids. We have to like defend ourselves. You know, big government is coming for
mhm.
homeschoolers, those types of things. A lot of times that messaging, sometimes that messaging is coming from inside the house, but sometimes it's
Right.
just coming from the other homeschool um, community in general.
Mm,
And so it is really interesting because like I grew up in a time where homeschooling was not uncommon enough in our area that like I didn't fear going to the store at 10 in the morning and, you know,
mhm.
being having a truancy officer called on me. That was not something I was afraid of. Um,
Not
but
like previous generations that may have been like,
right,
close the windows, don't go anywhere during
exactly.
school hours, stay inside.
Exactly. I didn't have that fear. And so There definitely, but there was the level of like, if someone does stop you and they do question you, having that kind of defense ready to say, well, I'm homeschooled and I did all my school yesterday, or I worked ahead, or, whatever.
Mm,
So it is kind of an interesting thing that you bring up, that like maybe there is that level of like, we are taught to defend our homeschooling
mhm,
beliefs in the system, and so that then leads us to become lawyers, because we just have
mm.
years and years and years of already fighting that stance. And so you might be onto something there. Uh,
It's just something I've noticed. I'm just like, hey, this is leading to this, this is leading to that. There's
yeah,
weird other form of homeschool math. Is the math of homeschool leads to lawyers defending conservative
right,
policies.
right. Well, and I think what another thing I found interesting this past year, I watched the Shiny Happy People documentary
Yeah.
series, and uh, both seasons of that, but specifically the first season,
Hmm.
I find it really interesting how throughout the whole thing they kind of hint at the Duggar dad. I'm trying to remember his name. Bob, was it Bob?
Jim Bob, I think that's his name.
Jim Bob,
Yeah,
yes.
Jim Bob. Jim Bob.
Yeah, how he was a politician, and then
Hmm.
he doesn't get reelected, and then he's running again for political office when his son gets caught with child pornography.
Hmm.
Surprise, surprise. But also how his son had also kind of entered the political sphere, and just
Hmm.
in general how kids in their homeschool community were kind of being taught and pushed into a political atmosphere. And
Hmm.
that's not something that my parents definitely pushed on me. My parents definitely were like, whatever you want to pursue, that's
Hmm.
on you. But one of the interviews that I thought was interesting in that season is Alex or Brett Harris, who for people who have listened to the show, you know that I talk about I Kiss Dating Goodbye. Alex and Brett are Josh Harris's younger brothers, and they had a
Hmm.
movement more from our generation called the Do Hard Things movement. And they had written a book, and it really surrounded around this idea of young people doing very hard and impossible things. They would always tote this story of a guy who sailed around the world in a sailboat at like, he was between 16 and 18 years old. So, like, insanely young to be doing this kind of a thing. But it was all these stories of young kids doing these impossible things. And mixed in there would be stories of young kids being involved in politics
Hmm.
and going, right, and going to Washington, D.C. and presenting
Yeah.
before, this board of whatever, or this committee group or whatever. And so, but what I find interesting is like, it kind of lends itself, I think, to the speculation that we're making of like, also Alex and Brett, famously homeschool kids, their dad huge in the homeschool world. Um, but does it lend itself to this idea that homeschool kids are intentionally being kind of raised and groomed to take political spaces to push forward a conservative ideal? I'm kind of
Yeah.
thinking yes.
It's interesting that you have legislative days in almost every state where you have homeschool kids go to their state capitals and either play music and show their test scores, which they're not real test scores, but as a way of saying, see, we don't need government regulation. Look at our test scores and how much they're so much better than the public schools. They're not. They're all fake. That's another thing I feel like I want to shout from the rooftops is that homeschool test scores are fake. The emperor has no clothes. Your test scores are fake. Because just I don't know how long ago it was, but in Idaho we have this thing called Pie Day where homeschoolers make homemade pies and serve them to lawmakers, so they're bribing them with pie and they're there to say we don't need government regulation, we don't need the vouchers, because that's another thing happening now is now that states are offering vouchers for private school, there's the talk of should they also go to homeschoolers, but then you've got some homeschoolers who are saying no, that's just more government intrusion, and when government gives you that money then they're going to start putting on more regulations and we don't want that, so you've got to keep everything private. So that's all fun, but and even the idea that I don't know if you did this, but apparently you'll have kids who are asked to write letters, handwritten letters to their state lawmakers or national lawmakers, to say, hey, thank you for all you do. We love having our homeschool rights. So you really are grouping, at least in the conservative Christian form of homeschooling. It does feel like you are grooming kids to you know, be number one, very involved in politics, but also, yes, to take office.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that because I think, like we've been saying, it does feel like this push to do these things, and I think organizations like HSLDA that fight for the rights for parents to home educate their children, to keep to keep the government's hands really out of it, in a lot of circumstances. I believe it's like it's 40 something odd states. It might be 48 of the 50 states. Like you can be a convicted child sex offender and still homeschool your kids.
Mhm.
A lot of states, you can have an active CPS investigation on your family, pull your kids out of school, and start home educating them. And so
Yeah.
there's a lot of these things that are like very, in my eyes, very common sense, right? Of like, as a
Mhm.
society, we should say that's bad, that's wrong, and we
Mhm.
should not allow that. Um, and in the same way, going back to my point before of like, I also think as a society we can come to some kind of agreement. Maybe this is very optimistic of me, of what are important things that children should learn in the school system, and even if it's just a very bare bones understanding of like, hey, this level of math is important to survive as a human being, and this level
Right,
of
right.
English and science and things like that. um I do think we can get there. Maybe that's super optimistic of me.
Mm.
But we also, like you were saying, places like HSLDA very much push for kids to also write those letters, to
Mhm.
be vocal about it, right? Because our
Yeah.
legislation and our legislators, they see that and they go, okay, cool, we're doing the right thing, right? They are
Mhm.
getting that affirmative language to them. And so I think also it is equally as important that those of us
Mhm.
who want to see other things take place, I would like to see much more of the voices of children, and the rights of children, being talked about in school systems, and access to
Right, right.
things, like mandated reporters and standardized
Mhm.
testing and things like that. Those are things I push much more hard for. It's like we equally have to write them letters saying, "Hey, we want to see these changes made."
Right,
And
right.
that's I think what's interesting about the conservative homeschool group is like they are very actively involved
Mhm.
in providing that. Where the rest of us are like, just do this thing. We say it once and then it's like, okay, I said it. It's out there. It's like, no, we got to say it over and over and over again because HSLDA and conservative homeschool groups are going to continue saying it over and
Mhm.
over and over again. They're going to drown your voice out if you don't also speak up.
I don't know if you know about Ryan Stoller, who founded Homeschool Anonymous and was one of the founding members of the Coalition for Responsible Home Education, but he said a lot of the same things you said. And he'd be a great person to have on the podcast too, by the way. I think you should reach out to him. And he's also talked about the going to the state houses and being paraded around to lawmakers, that it feels like you have to be on, even though a lot of homeschoolers are not okay. He's talked a lot about especially substance uses and thoughts of suicide and just people not having a good time, but feeling like they can't say it because we've got to defend this one thing. And if you say one wrong thing, they're going to regulate you into non-existence.
Yeah. And I think what's hard about this conversation that we're having is
Mhm.
obviously it comes off kind of negative in a lot of senses, right? We want to see change. We want to see it be better. That's, I think, the
Right.
ultimate goal of this conversation. And the way we do that is talk about the things that aren't working, and
Hmm.
and that can come off as really negative. But I promise you, folks, it's not trying to be negative. It's just trying to say maybe this didn't work the way that you think it's going to work, or it's not working the way you want it to work. And so let's just change this. Let's change the formula a little bit, and and make it better for the next generations of homeschoolers. It's
Hmm.
part of why I wanted to have you on the show too, because I think, like I was saying, like we were talking about earlier, the different types of homes that exist under the homeschool umbrella,
Hmm.
it is important to acknowledge that online school is a thing. And
Hmm.
a lot of the same things that can go unchecked in a private homeschool environment can probably also go unchecked in the online school environment. Um, and so, because you're at home, so even though you're going to tutoring, even
Hmm.
though you're doing those things, I'm sure that all of a sudden the socialization is gone down in your life at
Oh,
that point, I'm
absolutely.
assuming.
Oh, and I'm an only child too, so I pretty much had very little. And even though I did voice lessons and theater, it really was not enough socially,
Right.
especially as a teenager. I was, yeah, 14, 15, so I was just there by myself pretty much. And this is another reason why I think online school needs to be thought of as being under the homeschool umbrella, because we do face the same issues. As I've been doing more digging, I've found, people who've gone through online high school, and they had the exact same issues that a lot of people who were, independently homeschooled or privately homeschooled, or even went through private online schools are facing, because you're more vulnerable to a lot of things.
Right.
And one of the pushbacks you'll hear is that, well, kids in public school get abused. Kids get abused by teachers. Kids get abused by coaches. Kids don't always get, uh, you know, if you are being abused at home, it doesn't always get reported. No one always says anything. But the thing is that in public school, if teachers even so much as suspect something, they have to report. Even if it doesn't go anywhere, they have to say something. And I feel like within the homeschool movement, there's this big fear of CPS, and it has been for a long time. I find it interesting that as in the 70s is when all 50 states started to have to create CPS, their own child, whatever their version of CPS is. And that's also when the homeschooling movement started to really come to fruition. Well, maybe not to fruition, but that's when it started to become more mainstream in the 70s. And that aligned with when um states created their agency to investigate child abuse. And that's also when you saw all this talk that, like, oh, they're going to come get you. Even though, according to HSLDA's own data, homeschoolers are less likely to be targeted, or not targeted. They're less likely to have a CPS investigation. I think HSLDA says they only get 300 calls a year because of social workers at their door. And keep in mind that they have 100,000 member families, so that's only 0.30% of their total member base. And allegedly, 37% of kids will have a CPS investigation by the time they're 18 nationwide. And I know that sounds like a lot, but keep in mind that would include people just making a phone call, or a social worker from a hospital, coming in because you broke your leg just to make sure you're okay. But that's the big thing. And it's not just HSLDA. There's other law firms
Right.
that advertise their services, that isn't even necessarily homeschool related, but they only accept Christian homeschool families if they have a CPS investigation. Because it wouldn't make sense to have a firm where someone pays a fee once a month that is less than, for the whole year, the cost of a lawyer's time, if 37% of your clients are gonna be in a case. That just wouldn't make sense. But I
Right.
you're just not being seen, because if you're at home all day and no one's seeing you, and even if you're going to co-ops, or if you're only socializing with other homeschoolers, they're not going to say anything, especially if they don't believe that what you've been through is abuse. Especially if there's someone who follows like the Michael Pearl style of discipline, or James Dobson, or Gary Ezzo, you're in the same social circle, they're not going to say anything.
Yeah. Well, and to your point about like public school, well, and you even mentioned it in your story earlier of just even when you were being bullied in school, you had a teacher or a counselor come in and speak to all the students and tell them to knock it off, whether they
Yeah.
listened or not. But that did happen,
Right.
right? But in a
Yes,
homeschool
yes.
world, that doesn't necessarily take place. Bullying, the homeschool community I grew up in, we had a fairly large homeschool community, lots of students. So socialization was not really an issue for us. It's very
Hmm.
different, obviously, for rural homeschoolers who you could argue are also probably a higher likelihood of needing access to mandated reporters and things like that. But
Hmm.
but um bullying existed even for us, and it
Hmm.
is interesting the way that it would get, I would argue to some degree, sometimes swept under the rug of just it never really got addressed. And then you
Right.
tack on the religious aspect of just like forgive and forget kind of a thing. And it's,
Hmm.
so it definitely not the greatest situation, I will say, for the bullying stuff. And that's not every family, but it was a portion of it that it just didn't really get addressed. And so it's
Hmm.
interesting today to even speak to people who are like, they were equally as bullied probably to you, but like and
Mhm.
they're like, there was never anybody who ever spoke up for me. It always got
Right,
swept under the
right.
rug. And so, and that's not to invalidate your experience. That's just to say
No, no,
that
no.
bullying exists regardless of where your kid goes to school or how they're educated.
Yes, yes, I think that's important to say too, like, homeschooling in any way is not bully proof. It does exist in homeschool co-ops or in tutoring centers, even though I didn't experience bullying at tutoring, but, it's definitely happened. Or even amongst families,
Mhm.
I'm obviously the only child, but, what if I was alone with siblings who were abusive or bullying and there was nothing to be done about it? And now that we're in this era where, there's so much you're seeing that the conservative Christian fundamentalist worldview is now taking over politically. That's also bleeding in socially. And I'm seeing a lot of people saying, bring back bullying when it comes to, trans kids and queer kids that are now out in the open. They're like, bring back bullying. And it's like, no, we don't need to bring back bullying. Bullying is terrible. It's awful. It's traumatizing. And it's not great. And also, that's another thing. There's more of a push to homeschool kids because, or there's more of a push to homeschool your kids because there's the fear that they might go to school and they're going to transition them, or they're going to read books with queer characters and that's going to make them gay, or other things that just that doesn't happen. First of all, in fact, there are some evidence that shows that kids who are homeschooled, when they grow up, they are just as likely to be LGBTQ as everybody else. In fact, there was one study that they were like slightly more able said that they would identify that way. So this does not protect your kids from anything like that. But yeah, it's interesting how homeschooling also goes along with the pushback against people being openly queer in society.
That's an interesting point to raise as well, because I've I found that in doing this show and even just like looking at my friends, like we grew up in a very heteronormative environment, right? And then
Mm-hmm.
uh, I was talking recently to somebody about there used to be this. It was a lesson, but we made it more of a joke in like youth group and stuff. And it was always whenever there was guys and girls, it was like guys are blue, girls are red, right? We don't make purple, we don't
No
mix, kind of a
purple at the
thing.
lock-in.
Right, right, right. Most people will resonate with some kind
I
of
think
some
anyone who grew up in the era that we did with evangelical Christianity, if you were there, is like no purple.
yeah. But what's funny is we always joke about, well, what if we make like dark blue or dark red, right? And but it became very true, because even though we were joking about it at the time and stupidly sometimes joking about,
Mhm,
being gay or homo or homosexual or anything like that,
mhm,
it it's interesting to now look back and see my guy friends who have come out, some of my girlfriends who
mhm.
have come out, my friends who
Yeah.
have transitioned, and are not trans or they're non-binary or anything like that.
Mhm.
It's very interesting because it is, I would I would say maybe 50% of them.
Yeah.
There's something
Yeah.
in there that would
Mhm.
identify in the LGBTQ plus community. And so it's to your point of, it doesn't really protect, because I mean, we were all sheltered from that, and I mean, to quote Lady Gaga, "Baby, I was born this way." Like
Mhm.
it seems to indicate more and more
Mhm.
to me that I'm like, I don't think it's a choice. I don't think it's
No, it isn't.
a misguided I don't think it's a failure on a parent to say, "Oh, my kid is now gay."
No,
You know
no,
what I
no, no,
mean?
no. Absolutely
It's
not.
just an interesting thing to see in the homeschool world, as it's kind of, again, we've blossomed now into adults and
Yeah.
come out of that environment where it
Mhm.
was a shameful thing to discuss that, or just wasn't even talked about. And
Right,
now it's like
right,
a lot of us are finding our voices to say, this is me. So even though I'm a straight
right.
white guy, like there's like, it is interesting to kind of finally find our voices to say, no, this is like who I am, and be like very proud of it,
Mhm.
because it just used to not
Yeah.
be that way. So
Yeah. And I used to be extremely homophobic having grown up in this environment.
yeah,
Um I used to be let's be honest, I was a piece of shit. Like you and I would not get along at all, but what I later found out is that that was just me projecting. So you're absolutely right. It does come from somewhere. You do say it in some way, whether it's the homophobic projection or the joking about dark red or dark blue. So
Right.
I feel like there's always a tell. There's always a tell when you look back. You're like, ah, there it was.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I I agree. I think I think there is that tell amongst people. And even someone like me who was I would say extremely homophobic. And finally making friends who
So
were
we would never
gay.
call ourselves homophobic. We just say that we love people and want them to know the gospel.
Exactly, exactly. I love all this. I love the sinner. I hate the sin. That was my
Exactly.
my line a lot of times. But kind of
Yes.
coming to a point of realizing that I was like, I am very wrong for thinking that way, and it
Mhm.
took a long time to get there, but it was um I'm glad I'm there. I'm glad I'm at a point I'm like, okay, ally. No.
Yeah.
So it's good. And I think something that I want to emphasize too inside of just the broader conversation that we've had is the fact that
Mhm.
like even for those of us who grew up in these very controlling environments, that grew up believing and kind of being indoctrinated into a certain worldview of the way things were going to be, it's never too late to go back and relearn, to change your opinion, to do any of these things. In the same way
Absolutely.
for the school that we missed out on, it's never too late to go back and learn that thing. Um,
Mhm.
it's just a matter of wanting to do it, right? And taking the
Mhm.
steps to do it. So, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Mindy, is there anything we haven't touched on that we should touch on before I let you go?
Yeah, I think part of the reason why online schools, whether they're private or public, need to be included in legislation around homeschooling is one of the things I keep looking back to is that if there were legislation around criminal records, around CPS investigations, around home visits, I probably would not have been allowed to do online schooling. And I don't want to say too much about my own situation growing up, but um if there were a background check on my parents, I would not have been allowed to do this kind of schooling where you're at home all day and not being seen by anyone else. That would have probably prompted either a home visit or at least another interview, and then they would figure out, okay, this should not be happening. And it's a weird thing to think about that you could have been saved by bureaucracy.
It is a
And
little bit weird, yeah.
it's a weird thing to think about, especially because that's not a sentence anyone ever really says.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, and anything that's even close, because then also you get to the conversation of micro schools and all these other options for schooling, because it's no longer just cut and dry of public school, private school, homeschool.
Right.
Uh, there's so many different things happening. So unfortunately, we are going to have to define legally what all these types of schools are and how we're going to approach them from a legal standpoint.
I think that's a really good reminder, and that's also why I wanted to have this conversation with you because
Mhm,
even to this day of like, when I mentioned the umbrella and all the things that are from umbrella of homeschooling and everything that's
mhm,
underneath it, I think still to this day, I very much sit in that like private homeschool environment. And so when I talk about
mhm,
legislation, that's what I'm primarily focused on because that's my lived
mhm.
experience. And that's why
Right,
I wanted to
right.
have you on to talk about to online school and things like that because it's equally as important. And should the laws also be impacting that part of the homeschool world? Does it, all those types of things. And so to your point,
Right,
I think
right.
we are going to start to have to really start to legally define terms of what
Yes,
are all
yes.
these different schools and how are they
Mhm.
gonna impact one another. And so
And I think one of the reasons it doesn't really affect that is because online schools, at least through the public school system, are legally classified as public schools. So
right.
because you're following all the other public school regulations and laws, they might not think that we need to go and do anything else as far as do background checks or do interviews with the parents or anything like that. But yeah, you this needs to be included in other laws. It can't just be parent-led specific homeschool. It has to be any type of schooling that is primarily done at home where your parents are either overseeing or they are the ones primarily teaching you.
Yeah.
We need to figure out what the laws are, defining terms, and yeah.
Yeah. I think too, one of the great things that I think can be done relatively quickly, to be quite honest, is that because education is still very much a state's issue, is that it really only takes a handful of states to start to enact some of these things where we can
Mm,
start to see data surrounding them and see
right.
how it impacts the numbers, right? How it impacts
Hmm.
CPS calls, how it impacts
Right.
some of these things, right? And so from there we have the data, and then we
Hmm.
can move forward with making it hopefully more of a nationwide process.
Hmm.
But that is something that I've also come to realize is like, you know, in an ideal world, yeah, overnight we stamp something and it's like everybody
Right.
across the world, across the country. But I've realized more and more that it's like, no, if we can get a couple states to really start to implement some of these things and start to see positive results from them, well, it becomes a lot
Yeah.
easier to hopefully get other states to come on board with that.
Yeah, and that's also tough because now we're at this point where you have the parental rights movement, which, believe it or not, the parental rights movement was founded by Michael Ferris, and that's an extension of HSLDA. And I don't think a lot of people real again, it's how involved are these organizations in all these little things that seem unrelated. But no, the parental rights movement very much is an extension of the homeschooling movement. And that's another reason why people need to realize what they're actually supporting. Maybe you've joined HSLDA because you want the legal protection, but you don't realize what they're actually doing with your membership fees. Here, there's been a big thing with libraries making minors only sections in libraries where otherwise you'd have to show your ID, which is absolutely ridiculous. But that has nothing to do with parental rights. Parents already have the right to decide what books they want their kids to read or not. If your kid brings home a book that you don't like, you can just take it back, or you could say, no, we're not reading that. Instead, you're trying to force your beliefs onto everybody else. Same thing with things like vaccine choice. There's a weird thing happening here in Idaho where they're trying to make mRNA vaccines illegal, and that didn't work out. Now they're trying to make it illegal for women and children. Like, how is that choice if you're trying to make it illegal?
It's yeah, no, it's very interesting to see how the yeah, they want like, you know, they want like freedom of choice, right? Like, but they also don't want freedom of choice. Like it's like it's coming out of
Like,
like
you want freedom for your choice.
you
That's
want
what you
freedom for
really
yours.
want.
Yes,
Yes.
exactly. And but it's stripping away the right of other freedoms. And so I think that's what's
Right,
really
right.
interesting. I live in Tennessee.
Hmm.
Similar. We have a lot of we're Republican supermajority here,
Hmm.
and so
Same.
a lot of stuff just kind of unfortunately goes past. And gets passed, and it's very scary. It's a scary thing to
Hmm.
be a part of, and not a part of, but to be involved in, and see, because yeah, these decisions that are getting made is just
Hmm.
sometimes I wake up and I go, what are you doing? Right? Like it is
Right,
really that
right.
question of like, what are we doing? Anti-vax is a great example of that. Like, what are we doing here?
And I
Um,
feel like the anti-vax movement also originated within the homeschool movement. I feel like before the Wakefield MMR causes autism, it was mainly homeschoolers that were in the just the crunchy lifestyle in general. I feel like was mainly a homeschool thing.
it's really interesting because I feel like there is, you know, I'm still somebody who believes in like questioning a lot of things, right? And so
Right,
questioning
right.
science and things like that. I
Hmm.
think that that's valid. And I understand it's really easy to fall down the pipeline, right? The right wing
Right, right.
conservative anti-vax
The crunchy
pipeline.
to alt-right
The
pipeline.
right of
Which,
like
yeah, because
you
again,
know
it's like the original homeschool movement was not conservative Christians. It was hippies. That's who originated the unschooling movement, and then somehow conservative Christians adopted it because they were afraid of all the social changes happening.
yeah. Well, if history tells us anything, it's, Christianity has a really good way of latching itself onto secular and pagan ideas and
Yeah,
taking them
yeah.
over. So,
Oh yeah, yeah. The summer of love is what led to the religious right.
oh my
It's
Lord.
true. It's
Yeah,
true. It's
yep.
it's crazy because I feel like people our age, we look at the boomer generation and you're like, what happened here? How did you go from this free love, civil rights, second wave feminism, and then you go on to vote for Ronald Reagan? What happened here? And then you look and you're like, oh my God. And now we're seeing it ourselves. Because I feel like 10 years ago, if you had friends who only ate grass-fed organic food, use essential oils instead of going to doctors, or they didn't get their yearly flu shot because they heard that there's an ingredient there linked to cancer, they were more on left leaning. And now it's the exact opposite.
Yeah, it is really weird how it's very much swapped in a lot of
Yeah.
cases for stuff like that. It's very strange. So,
Yeah.
man, this is a conversation that I feel like, again, it's one of those like it is really almost a black hole of like it all ties
Really is.
together
It
in a very
really
strange way.
is. It's like
And
I feel like I
so,
need to have a red string and like connecting everything because it's like it really is all connected.
yeah, yeah, no, for sure. And so, Mindy, I thank you for coming on and at least scratching the surface with some of these topics with me because it is important and it's something that it. When I started the show, I didn't want to get political, and then I realized that just
Right,
homeschooling in
right.
general is a political statement, and
Yeah.
so it
Yeah, it's
really is hard.
unfortunate. It really is. Unfortunately, everything is political when you really look at it.
Yep, yep, that's the
That is
reality. So,
unfortunate. But that's another thing. We're at a point in 2026 where religion is not at the top of the list of why people homeschool. The main reason is that it's just people are not happy with their local public school system, or they feel like their child is not getting what they need, so they're turning to homeschooling as a way to do this. And unfortunately, again, it's like you're just a mom or a dad who's just wants to do what you think is best for your child, but you're being represented by people who have ulterior motives. And if you're not paying attention, you're not going to know what you've gotten involved in.
yeah, no, that's very true. I think it's very quick and very easy to kind of, you open that question of like, how does homeschooling work, and how do I,
Oh yeah.
how do I do
Oh
this, right?
yeah.
You just Google how do I homeschool
Mhm.
my kids, right? And
Yeah.
if you click the first search, it's going to take you down a whole spiral
Mhm.
that'll lead you in a bunch of different directions, to be quite honest.
Oh
But
yeah.
it'll
Oh yeah.
probably pull you into kind of that very conservative homeschool
Mhm.
religious environment. And so I think it is important to be reminded that it's like we have to do our research. And for people
Yes.
like you and I,
Yes.
it's again a reminder to say, okay, well, for those of us who lived through some of it and now are just
Mhm.
studying some of it from an outside perspective, it's important to talk about it. It's important to
Yes.
talk about it
Yes.
with people that we know who have children, um, because it, it takes a long time to research this kind of stuff, and it's purposeful. It's purposefully made very hard
Yes.
to kind of dig down. It's a black hole. It's a black hole for a reason.
The research, the so-called research that you'll find claiming that homeschoolers have better test scores or whatever, that's all completely fake. That was made by one guy who used to be a zoologist and then went into homeschool research, and then you find out that his research, quote unquote, is just him asking parents their opinions, and his daughter has actually come forward saying that he was abusive and that he taught her no math. Again, homeschool math. Um and that he was just awful and that no one should trust him.
Yeah,
And that's the thing, you don't know where to look when you're just putting things into Google. You're just going to get
right,
whatever comes up.
right.
Because again, homeschooling is just and it doesn't help that everyone homeschools different. So that's why it's so hard to get actual data. Because there are homeschooling families where they get up at 6 a.m., they start school at 8:30 and finish at 11:30. And in that time, you have to be in your schoolroom and doing school and even raising your hand to use the bathroom. And then there are the other extreme of families who are unschooling and doing whatever they want to do that day. So that makes it hard to get
Yeah,
accurate data of what homeschoolers are actually learning, how they compare to public school and private school, and just whether or not um what kind of regulations we need, what
yep,
laws need to be passed, how we're going to protect children who are in abusive situations. We just that's a big thing, is that we need more data and we need more
yep,
accurate research on what's actually going on within the lives of homeschoolers of all types, whether you're homeschooling in a way where you're creating your own curriculum, whether you're doing it through an online school, however you're doing it, we need to know the truth. We need to know
yeah.
the truth.
Well, in this, I'm just going to kind of put this as a call out to anyone listening, watching, who maybe was homeschooled. You don't talk about it. You put it in the shadows. I was that person for a little while. I got to college and I had decided I'm going to reinvent myself. I don't want to talk about being a homeschool kid. I wasn't necessarily ashamed of it, but I was just like, I'm moving past that part of my life. And that's no longer going to be an identifying factor for me. Here we are now, almost 30 years old. And I'm like, hell yeah, I was a homeschool kid. I'm that weirdo. And so, but the more that a lot of us can come forward and talk about these things, that is also very valuable data to understand what it is, how that has impacted, because a lot of that information comes currently from the former homeschool parents. And most homeschool parents, intentionally or unintentionally, have a little bit more of a rose-colored glasses view of how they taught their kids. And so we need student input. And so I want to figure out the best way to kind of collect that and point people. But if that's something you're interested in doing and talking about, like, reach out to me, because I think that's we need to be doing that, and we need to be presenting our experiences and how it's impacted us, where we are career wise, where we are in life, all those types of things. Those are important data points that can be used to help impact the next generations of home educators. Keep in mind, I'm not against homeschooling, but I just think we can make it better for the future generations. So, with
Right,
that,
right. I'm not against homeschooling either. I think it can be a good option for kids, but I'll even tell people myself, if you are thinking of homeschooling your kids, you need to talk to formerly homeschooled adults, because we are going to give you the good, the bad, and the ugly of what happened. Parents, again, I feel like a lot of homeschooling parents, they do paint it out as like, I homeschooled my kid and now they're a lawyer. But what you don't realize is that your kid who's a lawyer had 3 stints in the psych ward because they attempted suicide, and they had to really claw their way through college because they were so far behind and didn't realize it. Just hearing so-called homeschool success stories doesn't necessarily tell the whole truth. um yeah, if you're a homeschooling parent or considering homeschooling, you need to reach out to formerly homeschooled adults and get a variety of perspectives. Get people who have those amazing experiences, like what made it so great, what did their parents do to make it so good, and of course, talk to those of us who it wasn't so great and why it wasn't so great and what could have made it better. If And of course, you're going to get people who are like, homeschooling's terrible, don't do it, it should be illegal. I don't believe that. I believe that it can be a good option, but it needs more regulation. And yeah, this
yeah,
is not where I thought this interview was going to go, but I feel like we need to talk about these things. That's why we're here.
I'm with you. I appreciate your perspective so much, Mindy, and I appreciate you coming on the show and having the conversation with me, because it is, yeah, it's a topic that just needs to be discussed. And so,
Yes,
with
yes.
that, we're at time. But I once again appreciate you so much for coming on and sharing your story and being open with us and being open with the research that you've done. And uh, I love the people who hyperfixate on some of this stuff, because they they have the data, and they and so having them come on and be able to share, you know I've done this and seen this research and talked to these people, that is helpful, because it is a trek for sure. So, Mindy, thank you, thank you, thank you. Welcome to the Ex-Homeschoolers Club. I'm going to officially give you an Ex-Homeschoolers membership card, because as we've
Very
discussed, as
good.
we have determined, you are a homeschool kid.
Yeah, now we know for sure. Now, if anyone wants to debate that, can be like, I am an official member of the Ex-Homeschoolers Club.
Exactly, exactly. So, with that, to the audience, thank you guys for listening. If you enjoyed it, do all the internet things like subscribe, comment, share it with friends. You know what to do. If you want to reach out to me, exhsclub@gmail.com. Thoughts, if you want to be a guest, if you, like I mentioned before, if you want to figure out a way to create some data points around us homeschool alumni, uh, I'm all ears. Okay. And so with that, I'm going to let you go. I'll see you next time. Peace.